she says that winning 5 tournaments is not what she's most proud of, but becoming the champion of DJ's next stop before is. Oh. She's also conflicted from being judged by a certain capable Right. The deputy of opposition is Mr. Evan, even more macho than Roshan Wong. And he inspires to be like my, hijab, style. And even though he has responded with 20 levels, he still has 20 left in his head. And this causes him insomnia and anxiety attacks. Right, let's call up DJ to stage. Right, now closing government, Sri Ahmad. First speaker is Amrit Agastya. According to the she is a closeted girly girl who will never tell anyone she loves pink. And she only jams out of parties in the USA. And the women, according to Amrit, dances like a person having a fit while trying to juggle. And she trips in heels and generally has a horrible fashion sense. Let's invite Sri Amma. Alright, finally, closing opposition, also Sri Prabhakar. The first speaker is Kishan 14 Sivabalan. He likes a lot of children. And according to him, it's very, very short and very hard to do this. And his teammate, Nicola Gunnar, tells us wants to tell you that he has a 6 packs in the process, but he's hiding it properly. I told him to come on, and he really loves his brother, Sargent. Right, let's go to his brother. Right, let's see what we can do. Now, let's introduce the judges for the finals of this big quarter. Right, firstly is Hazim. Right. Hazim is a novice finalist in 2012 as well as the best overall speaker for the tournament, and he's also the Royal 2014 champion. And also also a fun fact about him, Dutch topless in Singapore national. He's ethnically Egyptian, born in Canada, raised in USA, and currently studying in Malaysia at IIM. He's very confused, just like you. Right, next is Mr. Brad, all the way from America. Brad is, all the way to Alaska. Brad is the world's PTA. Right? He's also the second overall best speaker at the 2012 US Championship. His family is Scottish, and he knows that the US will be Portugal tomorrow morning at World Cup. USA. Right. Next is Jasmine from Gujarat. So, Jasmine is the top 10 best adjudicators in UADC 2030. She's also the champion of the recent IIM Open and Royal Junior. Also the final president. Next is Mr. Raza. Raza is the overall best speaker and also the champion and finals best speaker of the ASCC 2013. He's also the Open quarterfinal judge of 2011 and also the Jesus IB Grand Finals adjudicator. Next is Elvira. Elvira is the overall best speaker of the ASCC 2012. She's also the CPPO 2014 final judge. And she's also the LIDC 2014 final judge. Next is Matt. Matt is the PCA of the 4th Kids BP tournament. Sorry, there's a missing line. Last year. Sorry, last year. Yeah. Cool. Right. He claims to be the most probable champion of the Kids BP Masters 2014. And he also claims to hate kids, but he doesn't know why he's here judging them. Finally, it's Mr. Gary from KU itself. Gary is the semi-finalist of Movement Malaysia, and he's also the quarterfinalist in MMU IB, and also the grand final judge of CKPO 2014. Right. So that concludes the introduction of the judges and speakers. So I'll pass my chair. Thank you. Without further ado, I call this house to order. All right, let's try that again. I now call this house to order. I call upon the debaters to debate the following motions. This house will punish the use of conscripted soldiers as a crime against humanity. I call upon the Prime Minister, Mr. Roshan Simabala, to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Here.
You might have microphone difficulties. In the meantime, I'm going to ask everybody to please silence your phones. If a phone goes off during the round, I will find you. Bad things will happen. I don't know what those things are. You won't like them. Not like that. Hello? Hello? Everybody hear me?
An act of limiting the consent of any combatant in crime, be it whether you want them or not, is something that is a crime against humanity. Opening government is going to tell you why this action is extremely harmful and why the severity of this crime demands punishment that is of this level. Our policy on two prongs. Number one, the International Criminal Court will punish the state or a dictator or whoever is in charge for the action of using conscripted soldiers in front of the international audience. Number two, the severity of the punishment will be decided by the court as we want to do how bad it is. But two questions. Number one, what are conscripted soldiers? And number two, what are crimes against humanity? Conscripted soldiers in these circumstances are individuals who never had the consent to join the military, who were forced and stripped of their rights as a basic human being and forced to be a part of the army when they didn't want to. They could never say no and they would always be a member of the combatancy. We think this is extremely problematic. But number two, what are crimes against humanity? Crimes against humanity are crimes that generally violate human rights and official human rights that every single individual in this world necessarily together agrees. The crimes against humanity reflect issues that every single individual is involved in. We're going to tell you why this is bad. Number one, why the conscription of usage of soldiers fit into the criteria. Number two, why this policy would put a severe impact on nations who do not use conscription soldiers. Number three, why this action is a manipulation and this is another extension of the criteria. And number four, why this is a just punishment for the dictators or whoever is in charge of these consequences. Number one, why conscription is the criteria of crimes against humanity? 6 reasons. Number one, in the action of consent, which is a basic human right that every single individual is able to serve, doesn't exist when you conscript a person. When individuals like Al Qaeda who committed terrorist attacks didn't give the consent to victims to not be in the situation, they killed these victims without their own. Obviously, they didn't have consent, and in these circumstances, they were also committed for crimes against humanity. This is similar because consent is irrelevant and doesn't necessarily exist. Second criteria or second level. Your whole life as an individual is generally taken away from you. You are a robot, and you're murdering people by the actions of say you are no longer a human being, you are just as good as a drone that is working in these situations. Similar to ISIS in Iraq and Syria, where they kidnap people and destroy their entire lives, they will also be charged of crimes against humanity. These are similar when you take away the lives of these individuals. Third problem, before I move on, sure.
Conscription is simply the training of these people. We have things like the right to refuse or participation if these people are truly so afraid to go into war. So what's wrong with just training them?
The right to refusal of participation exists for individuals who consent to be engaged. But secondly, most importantly, if you're going to spend 8 years training them, you're taking 8 years out of their lives without their consent, we think that necessarily harms them. That is your policy that you will sign. Third problem, why you put the people in sentence and why this is necessarily harmful? Sit down. Number one, you are a person who's being used as a sacrifice in circumstances. When you're put there, and the probability of dying is high because the experience you have, whether or not you want to be there to begin with, is arbitrary. Is something that necessarily is dangerous to you. Because Syrian governments force individuals without their consent to fight the Free Syrian army and they're used as sacrifices when they die in combatancy. You're taking away the life of an average individual. We think this is insane. But secondly, if they kill individuals on combatancy without consent, the action in itself is far worse to do so. Why? Because the severity of your murder is double when you do would actually want to kill a person, you are using the actions of a state. I mean, the state is forcing you to do things that you necessarily don't want to do in these circumstances, especially when you consider taking away the life of a person. In these circumstances, you are committed for crimes against humanity. Fourth problem, why forcing individuals to forego consent, values of these ideas reflect the entire race to begin with. Because a crime against humanity is a crime that reflects value that every single individual debates about, every single individual is concerned about. This means, sit down, that in these circumstances, the value of consent is severely deteriorated if you have the idea of one side ignoring consent. This questions the value of consent in general for every single human being. How far does the value of action control begin? We think that the value of consent should exist even if there is a dire necessity for the war to continue. This is bad because the value of consent for other human beings in general who are not part of this war will be severely deteriorated because of the actions of you refusing consent. But the fifth criteria is that you value the actions of soldiers in general. That means you're making them robots, you're using them as drones of your state, and in these circumstances, causing them. But the last one, most importantly, these soldiers are killed to non-combatants because they do not want to be in those circumstances to begin with. Before I explain this further, sure.
These are arguments as to what are the harms of being a soldier. Admirals will always tell their soldiers what to do in times of war. Side opening government has to prove how the marginal benefit of these people benefiting the winning party in this war is not proportional to the harms.
The difference is, if you want to become a soldier, if you want to fight for your country, that's the one to have the patriotic values. If you are conscripted into these soldiers, you don't have those values. That's the necessity or the value of you as a soldier is severely deteriorated because you don't want to be there. You'll try your very best to get out of that. You think in these circumstances that is in danger. But the idea of non-combatants, we never ever force individuals or non-combatants, soldiers or journalists to be part of the war simply because number one, they shouldn't be, but number two, they don't want to be. In these circumstances, when value of consent is important in determining whether or not the individual is a non-combatant or not, whether the value of consent doesn't exist, the person is not a combatant because the person doesn't want to fight. In these circumstances, the force or usage in physical of non-combatants is already treated as a crime against humanity. We think this is a simple extension of that. But secondly, on why this policy is a very important deterrent effect on nations. Why is this visible? Number one, you fear punishment in general as a dictator. That's natural. But number two, you have a reputation to uphold in the international eye when it comes to economic trade, whether or not you are a good side to be in these circumstances. It's important to recognize this visible. Why is this good? Number one, less people will be coerced in doing so because less nations are deterred, more nations are deterred from doing this action of not enforcing these individuals. But number two, combatants itself, in essence, will not mess up in war. In these circumstances, you will not be messing up because you won't crack from a mental breakdown because you don't have the capacity, because you won't be there and want soldiers to individuals to do so. This is a side that wishes to allow constant victimization of individuals who don't want to be there, don't side with this side.
My thanks to the Prime Minister for his remarks, and I call upon the Leader of the Opposition, Ms. Deborah Wong.
Members of their soldiers, I think that it is necessary that you need to allow these things to happen, right? Because here's the delineation between us and them. We're not okay with states that force their people to commit genocide. We're not okay with states that go into, wars that are not in line with just war theory, right? Wars that are improportional, that are unnecessary. But we think that conscription is not a crime against humanity, especially since conscription really just means training. We think we're in fact doing them a favor sometimes when we get them fit, that kind of thing, right? But let's look at the two burdens that we're going to take today. Firstly, we're going to prove that this is not a war crime, and second, we're going to prove that it is necessary that conscription remains a legitimate form of self-defense for these particular countries. But before I move on to my arguments, let's talk about the things that Roshan presented to you. No, thank you. First, on the idea of consent. As I already told you, right, sometimes it's very much necessary for these countries to do certain things for the good of their people, right? We think that, however, consent is not limited when it comes to them actually going into this battle, right? I already POI'd to them, that right to refusal of participation. That if these people are morally abhorrent towards the kinds of acts that are going on in these wars, they don't have to participate in it. The only thing they have to do is get prepared if they were be able to participate in these certain things. But on the second idea of a crime against humanity, this is going to go into my first argument, right, on the delineations between this, because but before that, we think that the crime against humanity is generally genocide, right? When there's a definite murder of these people, we don't think that conscription means that. But on his last idea, right, that people who don't want to be so are therefore non-combatants. Look, non-combatants are people who are incapable to participate in a war. They are incapable to participate in a war if they weren't conscripted in the first place, right? We don't think that case stands. But on the last idea of deterrence, we don't like deterrence anyway. We think that it's a good thing that these countries participate in these conscriptions. Let's look at my three ideas that I have for you today. Firstly, on how conscription does not fulfill the yardsticks of what a crime against humanity is, on how you instead trivialize war crimes, and lastly, on how this is in line with the just war theory and how it's legitimate for them to use so. But before that, checks and balances, right? Apart from the right to refusal of participation, we think that states are always accountable to the parents of the people on the ground. They always have to explain if the war that they sent their child into was unnecessary, and if their child died because they weren't given sufficient, because they weren't given. We think it's enough to make sure that only have to train and not do atrocious things and ultimately die. But let's move on to my ideas after the first idea. What exactly is a crime against humanity? These are things like mass genocide, ethnic cleansing, inhuman removal of human rights, right? The principle behind all these things is that it's a definite, gross, improportional harm on a wide scale. Things like breaches like the war in Afghanistan, the 2003 invasion in Iraq, where a lot of people were definitely killed, right? So why is it that training people to participate in a war? How is it a war crime if it's only that, right? We don't think that it is a war crime, and there are severe harms that happen when you make it a war crime. Because let's look at my second idea, right, on how you trivialize war crimes when you do this kind of thing. But before that, yes.
Torture is a crime against humanity. Murder is never the yardstick for what a crime against humanity is. As long as you torture these individuals by putting them into a position that they don't want to be, that in itself is problematic.
Look, these people may not want to do certain things, but as long as these things don't necessarily affect them physically, right? We think that it's fine, because sometimes the state has to do these things. Like stay further on in my third argument. What a war crime in the cleansing from Germany, right? The use of chemical weapons in Syria, use of nukes, right, in Japan. These are things that have had long-lasting harms towards these people. These are huge scale. They affected more than just the people on the ground. There was fighting that affected millions all over the world. We think that, in fact, the nuclear bombs that were dropped in Japan, right, it still affects them up to this day. At the mention of these kinds of war crimes, people break down in tears. People don't know how to handle themselves. So is that really what happens when conscription comes in the picture? Do people cry? Do people have to pay remunerations up until today because of conscription? We don't think so, right? And it's harmful when you put conscription and war crimes on the same platform, okay? Because it makes them, firstly, it makes them look very much petty in comparison, right? Because they were talking about how the courts will decide what is an appropriate punishment. We think that it's very likely that the punishment is not going to be as high as people who actually have murdered millions, right? Considering then that it's going to be so improportional, the kinds of things that happen, we think that you ultimately harm the execution of these genocide laws because it's so improportional to each other, they're so different from each other. But more than that, we think that it's also unprecedented, right? That because we don't know what kinds of international repercussions happen here. When war crimes happen, right, there's a lot of things, right, like international shaming, things like Germany, right, they have to pay remunerations up to today. There are a lot of repercussions that happen when a country or a person commits these war crimes. You can't tell what happens, especially when, I'm going to move on to my third argument and tell you why it's so necessary that they're allowed to do so. No thank you, only from closing if I decide to do so. But let's look at my third idea, right? On the idea of how this is in line with the just war theory and why it's legitimate. So what exactly is the just war theory, right? It's talking about how wars need to be proportional and necessary. We think it's very much proportional, right? Because countries, states that are sovereign, they always have things like national security policies, ways to have self-defense upon them, right? And these are all something that any state must have. They must be allowed to exercise these kinds of things, right? Because you give you an example, right, of Singapore. There are very few people here, and it's a very small country. What happens if a bigger country, like a superpower such as the United States, tries to go into their country, tries to invade them? What are they going to do if they don't have a conscripted army, if they're not using as many people as they possibly can, right? They will definitely die. There is no way to protect anybody on the ground. We think that if the trade-off is that some people don't get the consent into going into training, it's a much bigger benefit on our side, that these countries are given the right to protection of themselves, that these countries are able to stand on their own, right, and have the amount of leverage that they can have on them. We think that it's very important, right, that you need to allow for a sufficient playing ground here. You must allow for smaller countries to be able to access the manpower that they can, especially when they're poorer, right, and they can't access things like, higher forms of technology or greater kinds of weapons that maybe richer, bigger countries can access, right? We think that ultimately it's incredibly necessary that they will use this as a war tool, right, to be able to guarantee the safety of their people as a whole, and it's a sufficient trade-off. We think that consent is never really a part of the state's policies when such a big thing is at stake. Thank you very much.
Oh my God. There's a saying, give me death or give me liberty. These soldiers never had liberty, they were forced into death. My speech says, firstly, I'll give you 3 responses to the flaws of opening opposition, and then 3 substantive contributions. So firstly, against OO. The first one is that on their death challenge, apparently conscription to war is training. No, conscription to war is being sent to war. You do enter battle through being drafted into your training, and once training is done, you don't go home, no, you're sent into the battlefield. Therefore, all your limits of a war against humanity happens if, one, there is physical and mental pain. Physical pain comes from, dying. Mental pain comes from soldiers who never wanted to enter conflict, being forced to enter conflict, even if their consent was taken into account. But then, and their stance was, they are against unjust wars. Well, unjust wars are when you use non-combatants. You are using non-combatants because these are individuals, citizens, who never want to be soldiers. Therefore, we don't recognize them as soldiers, we recognize them as civilians or being used in war because of a government's own decisions. Therefore, it's unjust because you're still utilizing people and weaponizing them without choice. There's a difference between taxation and death. But their first argument, even though they don't say that, the first one was conscription isn't a crime against humanity. And state explains it to the parents. That's why it's great. So what? Your children were still taken away without the consent of the person and consent of the family. When the child still dies, I don't think the parents are going to go like, at least the state told me why. Even still, the child is dead and the state forced it to happen. But then extending on this, they said, and this is their criteria for crime against humanity. 1, if there's a long-lasting effect, and 2, if the people on the ground are harmed. When you force soldiers to enter war and they die, it's the same effect because people don't get to live again once they're dead, so it's long-lasting. But 2, people on the ground, the civilians, the soldiers, are killed. Whoa. But then they said we're going to devalue crimes against humanity. We recognize when a crime against humanity happens, and we extend it when we see other atrocities happening. An atrocity is when you send an entire army of people who didn't consent into a battle which they are unprepared for. They are slaughtered, and when they are slaughtered, it is an atrocity. Hold on. But then they said remunerations. Germany can't pay anymore for some reasons. If you want remunerations, then as a punishment, pay remunerations once you're charged of this crime. After my rebuttals. But the last one is on just war. That the country needed to defend themselves. Just war isn't defending yourself, it's going to war. Therefore, every argument about them trying to justify themselves doesn't make sense, it's irrelevant. But even still, if your argument is the country needs to develop yourself, not by using people as weapons. A country doesn't expand by utilizing the people to kill or killing the people off. it's unfair to the people who do make up the nation, and the government isn't being accountable of its actual civilians. But before I move on to my substantives, yes.
Are you saying that contented soldiers are the only part of society or the only people in the country that have an obligation to protect your country, or are the only people that are scared that your country might be conquered?
Yes. First argument, manipulation. Firstly, on manipulation, what we mean is when these people didn't consent, they're still young men who's maybe in their early 20s. They're not really sure as to what war is, they've never experienced it. Therefore, they're unexposed. When you as the state take them away under false pretense, they are doing something good. Even though they don't know it, you're manipulating them without telling them the consequences. And here are the three harms. Firstly, false hope. You tell them and you say, you can come out of the war. You are prepared to go to war. However, the reality is, these people never wanted to do it, and they will still be unprepared because they aren't soldiers. When they don't have the hope, or when they actually enter the battle and they realize that the hope is nullified, it's a conscious wrongdoing. Because now they have psychologically harmed, but they actually realize that there is no way for them to win this war. But no, thank you. The second thing, or the second harm, is wars are a lot more harsh when it actually comes to entering the battlefield. The first one is physical and mental. Even if you're physical, you can sustain yourself physically, you have mental repercussions. No, thank you. That's what you call PTSD, post-traumatic stress distress. But even in the conflict, when you first come into contact with gunfire and actual enemy forces, 48% of soldiers crack under pressure, given statistics. When this happens, these people are going to crack because, or even more of these people, because they weren't prepared. No, thank you. But still, when it comes to physical being, or the physical requirements, if they didn't want to be soldiers, it's obviously because they didn't know or they thought they were incapable. Now you're sending people who aren't even confident in their own abilities to become soldiers. You're not having a great army there. No, thank you. The third harm, or knowing when to sacrifice. This is an abuse of power because you're sacrificing people on your own whim. If a person wants to self-sacrifice, then it's his own choice to sacrifice for his nation. The country cannot decide when you need to sacrifice what we think is right. Therefore, it's your decision, not ours. Your consent, not ours. No, thank you. The second argument on no more period. Second argument on how you're capitalizing on vulnerable individuals. Who are these soldiers? They're unaware of the war and what are the three things that makes them. One, they're dependent on state direction, meaning they trust the government when it comes as to how they're using them. The second thing is they're unaware of the harms of war because they've never been there. And three, is that they're scared of the eventuality that they might be exposed to. An example is in Germany during Nazi times, most of the soldiers were 19. They were conscripted into the army, and what fueled them was a blind trust into the government. Even though many were slaughtered in the battle against the Russians, even though only 20% of them came home. Second level this, no thank you. Why is it inhumane to capitalize on this vulnerability? First reason, you abuse their trust. When these young people trusted in you, or these individuals thought the government knew what was best for them, instead of giving them the ability to make that decision, you weaponize vulnerable men and force them to go to a war they never wanted. Second is you force them into a war. They were scared of the war to begin with, and you still sent them in. They were scared to sacrifice immunity because they knew if they did go, they would still die. But the third thing is choice. They never could choose, and they never did. Because you never chose, you're still using their vulnerable aspects as people who are unaware. An example is children are vulnerable, but we don't force them to do things that they don't understand. What we do is we give them an ability to make or rationalize a decision for themselves, but they understand the consequences of what they do. It's what's called a rational decision. Time's up. But the final substantive on how you force individuals to kill. The first level is, why didn't these individuals want to become soldiers? Because they don't want to kill and they can't kill. What are these soldiers forced to do? Three things. One, you force them to take up a gun and shoot other people down. They can't, and here's why. Either by moral conduct, because they're bowed, or they just don't want to kill another person, but they can't take it onto themselves with that pressure, or three, they just can't take it. Second thing is, you force them to go to war. There are pressures and anxieties in war, and they aren't prepared for it. Some can't because they're nervous to die, and then you kill their individuality. But the third thing is, you enter battle. An example is civil wars, where you're forced to even kill your own family members, the people you know, civilians, and they were forced. An example is in the Syrian civil war, they were deemed forced into a civil war where you barged into houses and you shot people down. These are moral consequences that they couldn't live with. For all those reasons, don't do an inhumane thing. Thank you.
Our next speaker remarks and all the opposition, Mr. Edwin Wong.
Hello.
These
countries face a direct threat in terms of warfare. They face harms upon people on the ground, harms towards their families, harms towards their brothers and sisters. We think it's of greatest sacrifice, and a sacrifice the state has to take upon itself, especially when its sovereignty is at stake, especially when it's the state's duty and mandate to protect people on the ground. Your side trivializes the ideal when you say you can't have any form of proportional warfare. Instead, you only can have a pool of small volunteers to protect your state in terms of unproportional warfare, where greater countries can use greater technology against you, greater manpower against you, and therefore lead you to lose your sovereignty at the end of the day. Those are situations which their side's okay with, not with our side. Let's go into a few rebuttals before I move on to my case proper. Firstly, on this idea of consent. Deborah already pointed out to you, and it wasn't really tackled by state, instead it was just brushed off, right? That when states are in a position of turmoil, individual rights have to be sacrificed for the greater good. What is the greater good, right? We provide a comparative. These countries face a direct threat towards individual lives and lives of people on the ground. The state has to take the preemptive measure to prevent the huge loss of lives, or the loss of sovereignty of the state, and or the loss of losing people, like losing their own own way to govern their own country under status quo, right? So we have to argue as well that these individuals who were conscripted to be soldiers, their life is at stake as well, even if they don't join the military, right? Because their country is at threat, they are getting invaded upon. I think these are certain situations where the state has to take a preemptive measure to counter and evade under those circumstances. Then let's go on to Sid's speech, right? Sid's speech was basically an argument against status quo volunteer of soldiers, right? Look, because all his harms, manipulation, post-traumatic stress disorder, status quo as well, right? Because that's basically how they attract volunteers, right? These generals knock on your doorstep and convince you to join the military, and you're unprepared as well, right? You don't know the you don't know the consequences of warfare. You haven't been in the warfare yourself. That's how they garner volunteers. They convince you that you'll be safe, you'll be happy when you come back, your country will be safe at the end of the day, but you never know the situations at the war. Those are arguments against soldiers as well. No, but even if this manipulation exists, we already told you that the greater good has to be prioritized under this situation. The country's sovereignty has to be placed first, then the people on the ground can actually live out their lives as proper humans instead of robots like they wanted to talk about. Then this last idea, right, that these soldiers just can't take it. They have to shoot people when they don't want to, they have to do unwilling things, and they often are used as sacrifice. I'll take you after all my rebuttals. They're used as sacrifices under these circumstances. We already told you, right? These soldiers, these potential soldiers who are conscripted, are individuals who face threats towards their lives, even if they aren't conscripted to the military themselves. It isn't a dichotomy that only outside they face threats to life, only outside they get sacrificed. Their side they'll get sacrificed and face threats to life as well when they're impeded and invaded upon as well. Our side has to take the preemptive stance to protect the majority of lives of individuals within that country by using these soldiers as using conscription as a method to protect the state against opposition or enemies. I'll take one. Yeah, sure. Anyone?
Sure, people have a responsibility to protect their nation, but you have to consider the likelihood of success. What if they all go and they fail because they crack down under pressure? That jeopardizes your entire mission because you fail as a nation.
If they crack down under success, then your country under your paradigm will still die at the end of the day. Your country will still be invaded upon, right? At least outside tries to protect the country, tries to protect sovereignty. Outside at least takes a preemptive stance of doing something instead of your side just surrendering and die under those circumstances. We are not okay with that. We want to protect sovereignty of the country and people on the ground. No, 3 substantives coming from my speech today. Firstly, how you change the calculus of these countries to commit current war crimes instead of just this conscription of vague war crime. Secondly, how you blur the lines between what is the role of the Geneva Conventions, and thirdly, how you actually prevent voluntary soldiers from joining the war as well. Firstly, how you change the calculus of these countries to actually committing these current crimes. How do countries make an assessment to fight wars? They do it for a variety of reasons, but they only take the first act or preemptive act when there's a threat of provocation. These countries conscript because they need all the men they can get. They can't afford to lose any men. They know that the defense will be extremely fragile, and they know they'll be conquered on first strike without conscription. What they'll most likely do now in order to counter the greater threat without conscription is they'll be prompted to use illegitimate war tactics, right? Guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical warfare tactics. They target civilians, they target their homes, they ambush individuals, they ambush other soldiers. These are circumstances they are forced to do out of compellation because they don't have any other men to fight the wars themselves. So these asymmetrical warfare tactics will actually lead them to commit the real war crimes which you want to prevent under status quo. When you prevent conscription, these are the tactics that they'll be forced to, and it's essentially harmful to the way that we are trying to prevent and circumvent these war crimes from being committed in the first place. It goes against the just war theory, it goes against proportional warfare. Secondly, how you blur the line between the role of the Geneva Conventions. No, what's the definitive yardstick of Geneva Conventions and how they prosecute crimes under status quo? The definitive yardstick is the inhumane removal of lives or genocide under this situation. legitimation. What's the idea that OG wanted to propagate to you? The idea of consent now becomes a yardstick within these trials. This means that consent also becomes a legitimate defense when they're getting tried for war crimes, right? They can easily say, I was coerced into this war, it wasn't out of my own will, right? These are war crimes committed out of like necessity, because like I was coerced, I was forced into it, not because of my own will. These are the things which harm the trial of war crimes, harms the role of the Geneva Conventions in circumventing these war crimes to begin with. But furthermore, okay, yeah, sure, I'll take you.
So when you make a decision, you are accountable for the decision. When the state decides for you, doesn't mean the state is responsible for whatever happens next. That's meaning you are accountable for your own faults.
State decides a lot of things for you. State decides that you have to pay tax and you're forced to pay tax. But what is the greater good at the end of the day? Those are things that we're citing for, right? Protection of sovereignty, protection of individuals on the ground, protection of lives, right? We think even if you have to sacrifice a few human lives at the end of the day, it's something the state has to do out of compassion, out of necessity at the end of the day. These are things that if you don't do, in the end they'll die and lose the sovereignty. Those are things that you have to place on a comparative. No, I've taken enough, right? Last idea, right? How to prevent voluntary soldiers from joining the war as well. Because if you listen to psychology, this is how they train soldiers to be. They become a robot. They become lifeless and inhumane as the soldiers, right? These are rhetorics and narratives that will trickle down to individuals on the ground who could potentially be soldiers as well, right? These are the rhetorics from old humane. They'll never get the volunteers they want to join those wars to counter the evil that they wanted to counter, even when their country is facing threats. You decrease the pool of soldiers, you decrease the manpower these soldiers have, and you weaken these countries which are already weak to begin with. That's where this further strengthens my first argument of asymmetrical warfare, of illegitimate war tactics that these countries will be forced to use at the end of the day. Your side doesn't prevent the real war crimes that actually happen in today's debate. Your side only propagates the idea that war crimes should be used by these smaller and weaker countries, because that's the only method that they're able to defeat the enemy at the end of the day. At the end of the day, you have to understand the comparative is extremely important. If our side doesn't take any preemptive stance, doesn't do anything, lives of individuals on the ground will be lost. State sovereignty will be lost at the end of the day. We are unwilling to take that risk. We have to take the preemptive stance and protect individuals on the ground.
My name is Anthony, the opposition for his remarks, and I'll call all member of the government.
Hi. Oh shit. Hello. 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 Oh no. Hello? Hello? Okay, okay, good. Okay? When war is meant to correct the inhumanity in the world, we think forcing people to be part of the war creates those war crimes that you seek to solve. But more importantly, we think it prolongs the war on the ground, and it leads to us having the inability to morally justify a war. Because that's what we think this debate is about. In the event where war is morally correct, we think you need to get the consent of people. But more importantly, you need to respect the dignity of these individuals to morally object that particular war. But before I go on to my two extensions, a few rebuttals. Number one, we think that the opening opposition to this debate hinged their debate on two things. Number one, they said the state has the burden to protect sovereignty. We say that the only type of responsibility the state has is when it's in line with the people. When a large portion of the society morally objects to that war, when it morally objects for whatever reason it may be a religious reason, may it be a cultural reason, we think those are legitimate standards that the state owes its duty to first. Second of all, the only analysis they had was taxes. We think taxes, you have the active ability to solve those policies. You were the one that voted the government in and voted those tax policies to begin with. The same way we think you should be able to shape the war, the necessity for that war to begin with. That policy is the same. But third of all, their side says we are willing to sacrifice a few people in the effort to create a better good. We think that's problematic for three reasons. In the event that people don't make judgment calls or their rationality is diminished, this leads to them having their moral objection translate into very vicious things. For example, during the Iraqi war, when Michael Douglas decided to shoot Afghanistani women on the street because he objected to the war, he objected to how his fellow men were dying on the street, we think this leads to inhumanity and gross war crimes. But second of all, they said this trivializes war crimes. That is contingent on these effects not being as severe as those, because we think the effects are as severe as things that happen within status quo. But third of all, they said this leads to us making consent a valid standard within the ICRC. It is always within the ICC. It always was. In the Nuremberg trials, when we tried soldiers, if you said you did not consent, we won't charge you. We charge the dictator because we recognize your consent was still legitimate. But fourth of all, in the event where your side, they wanted to say that your side makes it harder for voluntary soldiers to come into war. We think your side is the one that makes being a voluntary soldier even more harder, because you're willing to sacrifice fellow Americans for utilitarian state benefit. We think that if that benefit is not proven to the society and society does not opt into that war, we think you harm voluntary soldiers in those instances. But last of all, we think if war is really that necessary, if in the event where your government really believes that war is something that's not A, politicized, B, is something that is of grave importance, that you need to prevent a provocation, we think people on the ground will be understanding to it. People on the ground will be able to sympathize with that cause. But the point at which people don't, we think the moral standard of the states cannot supersede people on the ground. Yes, ma'am.
So if we say that the state has to be in line with people, does that also mean that the state has to be in line with protecting the lives of people on the ground by taking a preemptive measure?
And that's why my extension is going to tell you why you will never be able to protect these people. Did a good job in explaining why consent is a valid standard. We are going to extend on that and explain to you why we think the dignity and the moral calculus of people is a very important standard within war. Because we must understand two things. Number one, when there's a psychological and emotional harm to these individuals, this leads to several things. It leads to them committing war crimes within status quo. That means to say they use illegitimate tactics that because they were unable to react in any other manner. The other side said, well, it's only training. Then we question you, in the event where you really need to go to the war, you are willing to forego that moral objection. So we think, even if it's training, the fact that I know I'm preparing to go against my morality is something that your side still does at the end of the day. But second of all, we think a lot of war crimes are there, or we have war crimes, is not because it's effectively going to end the war. The reason we don't allow cluster munitions is because it indiscriminately and unproportionately affects people. It might be more effective to do so, but we don't take that stance because we need to recognize the humanity. The same way, we don't allow rape within status quo because it respects the dignity and the humanity of these people. What does this mean? We think dignity encompasses several things. It encompasses the morality of people and the subjective decisions and subjective versions of society they uphold. If the international community wants to uphold different types of people having different morality, we think this is the essence of what humanity has to uphold. We think that's important. But second of all, your side still allows people to lobby against the war. Your side still allows people to be against the war. They can't actually do anything to not be part of the war. So we think that prolongs the war in several methods. Number one, we think war is often politicized and for circumstances that are not necessarily true. We think the Iraqi war is a perfect example of how there was no evidence. It was a preemptive attack for no reason. We think governments often take the most defensive stances. We think in those instances, the only check and balance you can have is when people object to this. Objection means that you're not able to actively fund the war. You're not able to systematically fund the types of things that exist. Then the question becomes, how do we end the war? We think there are a variety of other methods you can end the war. We don't think war is won by soldiers. We think it can be won by diplomatic talks. We think it can be won by all these other methods that don't require the bloodshed of people. In the event where your soldiers don't consent to that bloodshed, we think you should be exploring other alternatives as a government. We think morality is most important. But last of all, we think this debate is also about the inhumanities within the theater of war. Because when people decide that their morality is being sidelined for utilitarian calculus, that A means you no longer legitimize the government's war, which means that as the war is going, you don't get political push on the ground, you don't allow people to rally for the war, which means the moral standard of that war gets lost in translation. So sure, you might be fighting the right war, but the fact that people did not consent to your war in war crimes means that you lose the moral ability to win that war. But second of all, we also think this debate is about justifying your actions and accountability. Because we really think that in the event where a government has the moral prerogative, and the event where war is absolutely necessary, you must answer to your people. The question on the other side is, why can't you lobby to your people? Why can't you tell them this is the moral way to do so? Because your side does not incentivize governments to do so. Your side promotes inhumane actions. But last of all, the last analysis on side closing is that we think humanity has to encompass dignity. It's not only about consent. It's not only about this abstract notion of valid forms of consent. It's also about the dignity of that person in terms of morality, because the society is shaped of different people having different calculus. That diminished rationality is a prerequisite to all those harms that come because of your morality being judged. We think for whatever reason it may be, we think the state owes a duty to that individual per se. We think individuals are able to morally shape that war because they are a collective bargaining power that exists. So we think inside closing government, this debate is about how to effectively end the war while still having A, the moral edge over the war, but B, doing it in the most humane way. Because if you concede war is a provocative act, we think there are other methods to end the war. We're supremely proud to propose.
Financial member remarks and call upon the member of the opposition, Mr. Ishinawa.
Conscripted soldiers are an asset to humanity. We think that making this a war crime in itself is counterintuitive to the fact that these are people who protect humanity and give value to war within society. Side closing government is going to argue three things. We're going to argue firstly how these conscripted soldiers and the importance of them being within this war are first within this debate, but secondly, we're going to also argue how it increases the effectivity of the humanity that actually exists within war by allowing conscripted soldiers to naturally exist. But thirdly, we're also going to argue how allowing the existence of conscripted soldiers is a prerequisite of the only existing check and balances towards other parties within war which are in nature belligerent, or other parties in war which don't comply with the Geneva Convention. With that being said, I'm going to respond to the two extensions that came from side closing government, right? Because firstly, they know about dignity is important. They told us that psychological trauma causes people on the ground to cause crimes against humanity or to kill civilians within the scenario. We don't think this is mutually exclusive, because all soldiers can suffer breakdowns. All soldiers can have that same feeling because no one has been to war before, Mr. Speaker. This is something to recognize. But we always have things like cluster bombs, where we do have a ban on them. We agree with side closing government. But this is proportionally different because conscripted soldiers have an obligation to do more benefits than damage in an instance. But then this is the essence of humanity. We think that living is the essence of humanity, and allowing conscripted soldiers to exist is how we preserve this. But then she told us that now how do we end wars? We can have things like diplomatic talks, and we can have every other thing in these aspects if you're a shorthand of soldiers. What is the problem with this? When your people are already in that state of fear, when your people are already threatened within the scenario, will anybody opt into their policy in the name of protecting their country? We need to force them to be within the scenario to show them the true value of being a soldier. But secondly, she talked about accountability, how you must answer to the people, how there's no incentive for individuals within status quo to join the military. Sure, but the accountability only exists when everybody has collective morality, supports or fights in this war together. We don't think that people in itself have complied to this within status quo. We don't think it's mutually exclusive to our paradigm. No argument. But then we're going to respond to side opening government, because they had four arguments. Firstly, why conscription in the first place? They told us consent is always there. But we always overrule consent when we see an overarching benefit. The same way in recessions, when people lay off workers or corporations fire people, we see it as something that's justified, even if we're foregoing certain humanitarian rights that people naturally have. So we see a greater benefit there. But then secondly, they talk about deterrence, because they say dictators will somehow fear the punishments of not using these crimes against humanity. We still have people like Bashar al-Assad who still use sarin gas on their people. We don't see this being any effective deterrent that any other thing actually exists. But the mental breakdown is already exclusive to every other person, because false hope is something that can never be premeditated, which you can never know whether that hope was existent in the first place. So it's not a manipulation towards the people, because by their logic, every soldier is manipulated the moment that they die within that war, even if they are people who proudly stood for their country. No thank you. But then the fourth argument, where they told us it was a just punishment. Now you disproportionately affect the trust that people have with their government. Firstly, we would say in times of conflict, this can be for good, to protect the people in the society as a whole, but trust in itself is something that's secondary. But a clarification towards opening government, this debate does not include civil conflicts. This debate in itself is only exclusive towards wars that are already internationally recognized. No. Our opening opposition talked about delineations, or they talk about just wars and changing the calculus of war, or even the goals of the Geneva Convention. The summary to their case, they want wanted to argue that it's much better in protecting smaller countries. We're going to argue how in itself it's important for conscripted soldiers to be within the scene of the crime to maintain humanity. Firstly, who are these individuals who are conscripted soldiers at the end of the day? People who are injected or pulled out from the workforce or social life within social norms. These are people who are different from every other soldier. We would call them assets. Why? Because these are people who have no incentive to join the military or no actual political influence or even any influence into joining the military like other individuals who are more likely to comply in this scenario. Why do we need conscripted soldiers, right? Because these are people who are most functional in war. These are people who have the same fear that every civilian out there has. These are people who know what it feels like to be within a war. These are people we need to have within war. Considering these are people who didn't have that kind of consent, people who didn't want to be in that state of mind, these are the people who are best in protecting society. Why? Because knowing that they are having some form, they have the same form of fear as everyone else. These are people who are more likely to act in rational calculuses or protect more people within war because these are people who know that it's right to protect people within war. This is different from any other soldier within scenarios like this because as they characterize, these are people who are not drones. These are people who act on their own interests. These are people who will protect the nation. But the conclusion to this is that this should not be a crime against humanity because it protects humanity in war. Knowing that these are people in itself who didn't consent to the war, these are people who have every other emotion that you don't necessarily rid yourself of training. These are people that are necessary in protecting people who are infavorable, people who are inferior, because they know what it feels like to be inferior, such as a person. Before I move on, cycle.
Sure, there are minor amount of countries like Singapore who don't have enough people to war. But what about the vast majority of nations like Iran and Syria that conscript individuals forcefully, although they have other people who want to go into war? What about those individuals?
I'm going to argue that in my second speech, how it dilutes the influence that they naturally have within the international scale, how this harms them disproportionately. But the second argument, how it increases the effectivity or the humanity that naturally exists within war. Why? It allows wars to be conquered much faster or won by the majority party in faster ways. In scenarios like this is a good thing because it can protect the rest of humanity or allow you to get that added advantage, allows you to win that war faster. We see this as good. It protects more people within society. It protects more people at the end of the day. But will this affect the functionality of soldiers? No, because in training, even when people are conscripted, they are allowed to be within the social norms or they are allowed to work the same way every other soldier would. We don't think that they are affected the moment they're put in the battlefield. These are people who are already prepared. No, thank you. But even if, right, we think that these are people who are allowed to make more just wars because these are people who are awarded the right to refusal. These are people who can wave red flags towards the wars in itself. They can be like a consideration as to when wars are naturally held. But what about countries that are big? What about countries that have capacity but still conscript their soldiers? These are countries that already imply values within the international community. Countries like US, countries like Iraq and Iran, these are countries that have direct influence towards the societal sphere. We think it's bad when you take away the influence at the end of the day because this is when belligerence happens even more. This is when the opposition parties which are not affected by these policies are more likely to take advantage of the current situation. We think that this is naturally bad. This affects the balance that naturally exists within war. This affects what naturally happens. But the last argument, it shouldn't be a crime against humanity because it's the only existent factor or the balance against non-obedient parts of the Geneva Convention. Because not everybody abides with the Geneva Convention. Not Syria, not terrorism at the end of the day. We can't make this a crime against humanity because it's the most humane way to fight against terrorism. The most humane way to fight against other parties that are humane. Making this not an option is something that's necessarily harmful. We are very proud to oppose. Sorry, give me a second. Sorry. Okay. War is a means to protect humanity. But we now disregard that because you're no longer human. You're regarded as a weapon. Side opposition wants to fight the war right, but they don't want to fight the right war. Because now they abandon the morality that we have in shaping the most moral war, and now they abandon,
abandon the diminished rationality of these people who don't understand fully their role in war, which will lead to them having more emotional harms, more psychological harms, something they never engaged with Amrit. But now let's go on into tackling their extension, right? And we think that their extension was largely just that it was important for countries to be able to enter these wars because now they want to prevent like belligerence. They want to prevent belligerence. They want to allow more representation in the society. First of all, we think that your society has to be able to be a part of that war because that's when we can guarantee the best representation of that society in that war. That's when you have the best moral representation, when you have the moral backing from your very own country first. We think that's the most important part because you disregard everything else that your society fights for, whether they want to be a part of this war or not, because you're willing to just go ahead and conscript these soldiers. You're willing to go ahead and simply take that utilitarian goal yourself instead of being able to get the best representation of society, regardless of whether they want to fight that war or not. And now, let's defend our extension a bit from Kishan. Because first of all, they tried to say that diplomatic talks are not necessary because they're not time sensitive. We actually think that having more time actually allows you to rally your people further. We think that having more time allows your people to find the consensus into maybe other methods or other alternatives into entering this war. Maybe finding a more peaceful resolution to it. Instead of simply constantly going in for a military intervention, you can now find the best way to actually fight this war. And that war crimes happen anyway. We think that they won't actually, if there's a lesser chance, or maybe it won't actually happen now if these people are now voluntarily entering these wars because their morality is now in line with the war that we're shaping. This is all in line with the ethics of war, that these are steps we're taking to stop using indiscriminate methods of killing. These are steps we're taking to make sure that this is a moral war that we're fighting, because now these people will have to adhere to the lines of morality we set to these wars. So cases like Michael Douglas, who resorted to a lot of indiscriminate killing because he opposed the war that he was a part of, will not happen on our side. But finally, that they're willing to have training, because now apparently training allows you to become a more moral person. Enough training will not guarantee you to still have the best ethics that are in line with the war, because you have to be able to support that war on your own. You still have to be able to want to represent your society in a war and be able to back your country in the intervention that they're willing to have. But let's go on into the extension that was largely not engaged with on their side, because now they simply disregard that we can shape the war into becoming something that's more humane. Because why is it a war against humanity anyway? You know why? It's because we are now crushing the humanity within these people. We want to preserve the morality within someone. Op hurts their humanity by rejecting all their moral objections. So if I feel like I shouldn't be able to enter this war because I don't want to be a part of something that results in more killing, if I don't want to kill more people, if I don't want to be a part of a war that extends more collateral damage, this is my idea of morality. These are all subjective ideas of morality that should be recognized by the state. But now the state ignores this because they want to take their utilitarian goals of war and just disregard everything that a person, they lose that moral backing. And in fact, more practically, they also lose any peaceful resolutions that can come from this war, any alternatives or a consensus they can find to actually have a more moral war, have a more ethical war. We think that as a state, if you want to intervene in a war, go to war, fine, do that, but you should be able to justify to your people why you're fighting this war, and at least have hear out their decisions before you simply enforce this utilitarian goal. We think that when you don't legitimize these wars, there's no political push for these interventions. You lose this moral backing, and you actually lose people supporting you in this war in the first place. So if they think that this might be the best way to actually intervene in these countries, you lose the support from your very own people, and you lose the support of the soldiers who
actually want to conform to these ethics in war. Now they won't be in line with a more moral war. They'll simply regard to more indiscriminate methods that will result in more collateral damage. That just hampers the image of having a healthier and more ethical war in the first place. Before I go on into the next idea, sure, anyone.
Preserving the morality of people who are going to be sacrificed to fight for this war, or all those civilians who might be saved by these people, because these people are
Sorry. I think that it's more important for you to be able to preserve, it's more important to preserve their morality, because sure, there will be people on the ground that will be harmed. But we think that since you are still, like, this is still a crime against humanity, when you're still going to extract all of that humanity out of a person to be able to just send them to war, that you will still have even more of an emotional harm from simply conscripting these soldiers. So yes, we think there's more of a harm on our side. But now let's deal with essentially what the case of opening was. Because essentially what it was, right, that they don't want to equate mass genocide to mass psychological harm. Because a mass genocide is only what they regard as a crime against humanity. We think that this actually trivializes the severity of harms that these soldiers can feel. Because why can't we actually equate this psychological harm that a soldier can face? Because first of all, you're taking away their humanity, you're taking away their choice, you're putting them under fire, you're putting them under fire where they don't have their choice to be able to decide how to protect themselves, even if they have that training to do so. So we think that's when you can actually equate all the psychological harms that they can face. And that finally, to actually create a more humane war is when you get these voluntary soldiers. You only propagate a harmful war when you simply conscript soldiers and you simply disregard the choice that they have.
I thank Mr. Government for the remarks, and I'll call upon the opposition whip, Mr. Nicolas Chandra.
Hello. If humanity is one that we protect, regardless of whether you were conscripted or not, why do we still call it a crime? We think that if morality is what side government wants to protect in today's debate, we think that we protect the best form of morality, the morality that perseveres and creates a form of morality that is from every part of society, every part of society in that particular country that believes for the same morality, that believes for the country to win the war, but your only delineation is that they won't be part of the war. We think that the intrinsic value or intent is still there for you to be scared that your country will be conquered, or for you to be scared, or that patriotic value is still there, but the only reason that you don't have is that they don't have a gun in their hand. Every other aspect that is existent to an ordinary soldier is also present within the conscripted soldier. Their only contention was that the idea of consent wasn't existent. We think that it's totally unfair, but we'll still deal with it. People still respect you the same when you come back from the war. Every other dignity or element of dignity that a soldier that comes back from war faces, you will also face. We don't see a difference in that. Secondly, the reason why I would save a little girl as a conscripted soldier is different as to why an ordinary soldier would save that little girl. He would save her because he wouldn't want to face conviction. But I would save her because I know how would I feel if I was in that position. I would know how my family and the friends that I left behind feel if I don't win this war, because I already have a gun in my hand. What I do next? Shoot the people that come in front of me. We don't see a delineation, or what's the harm in fighting for humanity as a whole. Why do you call it a crime against humanity? First of all, I'm going to deal with side closing government first. Have a seat after dealing with closing government. I don't need this. First of all, they didn't want to engage to Kishan's case. They wanted to continue. Even Aish wanted to continue to her own arguing for second speech of Amrit, but we'll still deal with them because we're the fair team in today's debate. First of all, is a war only justified when society deems it moral? That's what they wanted to argue. First of all, exactly, people that feel scared, people that feel the same morality in every other aspect of society, but cannot be part of the war, but just don't want to be part of the war because they are scared of being part of the war. That's the only difference under your side. They cannot be part of the war, or they just don't want to be part of the war. But the intention is justified because all you want to do is beat that enemy or go against the enemy. Under your policy, morality is only soldiers who volunteer. It's not a morality of the country, it's a morality of maybe 500 people. We think that under our policy, we have morality of the whole country. We have morality of every other aspect of society. Have seen. Secondly, they told us that now there's a chance that there will be an increase of war crimes. First of all, there are always things like mitigation or defenses that apply to conscripted soldiers. We don't see why that's exclusive to them. We already recognize that in status quo. Thirdly, they talk to us about the idea of dignity, and this will be harmed when we put conscripted soldiers. This is why it's very harmful. First of all, why is the dignity one that must be selfish? Why can't dignity be one of the whole country? Why can't dignity be one that you have to protect every other human out there, or every other human that is facing that human rights violation, or is being harmed, or didn't have the same amount of consent? Why must it be exclusive to you as one person having dignity? We think that it's better when you fight for the dignity of your country, when you fight for dignity of your society in the first place, because your dignity is that people won't be alive to face your dignity. We don't want to stand for that policy because now people won't even be alive to face that dignity. Opening first.
What about people that actively don't support the war you're going into? Does morality still exist? And will there be an urgency for overall protection if they don't want it?
Yeah, but there will always be a minority that doesn't agree with the war that you're fighting, but the majority is going to be the ones that are scared to lose that war, that fight for the morality of that country in the first place, but still cannot fight within that war. I'll take you later. Fourth thing that CG talked about was the idea of they want us to use other methods to win, like having negotiations and so on and so forth. We have moved away from things like drones that are unfair things against enemies that we want to fight in the most humane way possible. What else can we do rather than using humans, even though they don't have the consent, as your best case scenario was? In a state where we are desperate to end the war, we don't have a choice. If we don't want to take the risk of risking more people's lives, we think that we fight in a more proportional way. We don't see a harm in that. Closing.
But there's a large portion of society that doesn't want to opt in at war. That means the methods of intention of war is unjustified. Tell me why the government is not accountable to the very people it represents.
Yeah, that means if you don't opt into the war, you're going to be the people that is killed because of your unfair government. We think that the only dignity and morality that is left behind is for you to fight the people that is left behind, even though they were disproportionately harm, but you don't give them a chance because you think that the government is the one that is wrong. But even if you don't protect the humanity that you wanted to protect in the first place. Let's talk about our extension for a minute. Have a seat. First of all, we told you how these conscripted soldiers represent all parts of society, and we talked to you about the importance of these conscripted soldiers in the first place. How it increases the capacity of a country to win the war faster, and we create lesser dependency over people dying. That means we don't want people to die more, because under your policy, people will die more. With more soldiers, we have more strategies, more chances to conquer more areas in that war. We think that you limit the capacity for us to do that because of that limited number of soldiers that we have, even if they're not consented, or even if when you have a gun and a person is going to shoot you, is that you shoot him down. We think that that's already a subliminal value for you to win the war. The essence of conscripted soldiers is one that represents every other aspect of society. Have a seat. One that wouldn't harm the war, but save the war in the first place, because your belief is the same as everyone else. You know how everyone else feels. We think that the morality is holistic in the best manner possible under our policy. Let's deal with side opening government now. First of all, they told us why we have to deal with conscription, because there's no consent, and it's a sacrifice to non-combatants. That's the most truistic thing that don't have fear of being conquered. They also have patriotism, but want to protect the country. But the value that you leave behind is same. The intention is that you want to win the war, and your country has to defeat the enemy at the end of the day. Secondly, they told us that we might mess up, but soldiers, because we have things like trauma or PTSD, but soldiers that volunteer also have PTSDs, also have trauma when they enter the battlefield. That is not exclusive to your side, but it's better under our side, because it's basic humanity that you will shoot and want to protect your family, that want to protect with your friends at the end of the day, because the people, the subliminal instinct is that you want to fight against the enemies that might kill you or might kill your family at the end of the day, because they already know that there is a probability that they will die because if they don't fight in that war. We think that the false hope is not one that you give to the conscripted soldiers, but the false hope that you give your people that you left behind. We think that morality is better under our paradigm. We need these conscripted soldiers to save humanity as a whole.
That concludes the final round of the fifth annual PhD tournament. I will ask the other executive panel to join me in our deliberation that way.
I'm conscripted also.
Kun, do you have my sunglasses? Kun.
Guys, can I invite all the finalists to eat together at the table? Blue table. Blue table.